want to talk more
yeah,
about that.
I guess that leads in nicely. So I'm producing this. One of the things that I want to mention right off the bat is that we talk about Comic-Con as it was coming up, and everyone was just volunteering their time. They were putting this together because they wanted to do it, because it was something that they loved. And I feel like this project has been a little reflection of that. So everyone that we talked to, that sounds really cool, I like that. And so Michael, who, as we mentioned, he used to work as a grip in Hollywood, he's got these friends still, and they're like, that sounds interesting. I'll just bring my grip truck in, and you can borrow all the lighting. And we had an audio guy come, it'll sound much better if I just set up the audio for you. So everyone is volunteering their time. We have in the back of the room, Mark heard about this project, and he's like, I'm a professional interviewer. I would love to help you guys out. So he's done amazing interviews for him, Sun Jack.
I wanted to give him a
so they've been in on a major shout out on
Yeah.
this. They've done an amazing job working with us on this. And you know, if you want to speak to that, Mark, you said it because you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I knew Michael. Actually, he had been in Hollywood, and I've been in Hollywood as well, but we both came from San Diego. And but we've been in touch down through the years, and you know, mutual friends had told me that Michael was working on something about Comic-Con, and they knew me and said, "This sounds like this is your thing." You know, I'd done some rock and roll interviews with this guy as a producer, and he said, "This guy's doing something on Comic-Con. This is your thing. You should go and talk to these people." And so when I called Michael, he said the first one that he had lined up for this weekend was Scott Shaw, who's a good friend of mine and a mentor to my son Jack. And and the guy in the middle there with the mustache, the funky hippie in the middle. And so I said, you know, why don't I come down and talk to Scott, because I can at least get the oral interviews for Comic Fest started, and you know, this is somebody who'll be comfortable with me, and we can get a good story. And I enjoyed it so much. I said, well, who else are you talking to today? You know, and Pam gave me a list, and I said, well, I know this guy and this guy and this guy. I'll talk to Mark Evanier, I'll talk to Roger Friedman, I'll talk to some of these guys, and we'll have a conversation. It'll get to the heart of the beginning of this project, the Comic-Con Kids. You know, who these guys were that started. And every one of these interviews has been fantastic. I mean, it's just been a great conversation. And I think that anybody at any time viewing this, going into this archive and seeing these oral histories, are going to be amazed at the information that they get out of it. There's such an enthusiasm that hasn't dimmed. I mean, they're still looking back on it fondly. You know, you talk about the time having changed their memory of it. But they were so optimistic at the time that they could create something. And you know, we're talking about 1969, 1970, when you know you hear "Don't trust anyone over 30." These guys really sought out comics creators from the golden age, guys that they wanted to know something about, wanted to get information from, and they got that history. They went out and they met Jack Kirby, and they talked to these guys, and they created a place where they could all come together and kind of be outsiders together. And there was never an idea that they couldn't do it, that it couldn't become a place where people who were into sci-fi, people who were into comics, people who were into film, could come together with those, you know, Trekkies, could come together with those various interests and build something that, that has certainly taken off beyond any of their wildest imaginations at the time. But the optimism definitely comes through in the oral histories, and I think that's the main thing that I've got from the conversation. And I've only had conversations, you know, maybe about a third of the oral histories that they've done that have been ones that I've conducted. But the ones that I've conducted have been incredibly optimistic, incredibly enlightening in the way that they took an approach in the late 60s and early 70s to what was possible. And it just so happened that it was in San Diego. But because it was, it's become part of this history. It's become part of the history of the city, and certainly changed, you know, the way people think about San Diego. That's probably the #1 thing people think. It used to be the zoo. It used to be, you know, and now, you know, when you mention San Diego, that's probably #1 or #2, you know.
It's a zoo still.
If you've ever been to Comic-Con, you know that's true.
And that's a really important theme that came up in all of these interviews is we have to realize these were kids between 12 and 17 years old, and then I think Sheldorf was 32, if I remember correctly. So these were kids, and that's what they kept saying over and over again. We heard it. We never had the idea that we couldn't do this. We were just, someone gave me a list and said, here, go call Ray Bradbury and get him over here. And the kid would go do it because he didn't think he couldn't.
I was going to say, speaking of them being kids, I mean, we're talking literally kids, because the guy that placed the original ad that actually ended up hooking up Richard Alf and Sheldorf, who were, kind of the founders. The guy that was a kid named Barry Alfonso, who was 12 at the time.
Yeah.
And so he was like, thought it was cool that these older guys that were like 17 and 18 accepted him. And he was 12, and there was already like this generational difference. One of the quotes that came out this weekend that I thought was great was, don't trust anyone over 30 except for Jack Hurd. Yeah. One of my favorite quotes, yeah. So.
I was going to say, you're talking about the youth participation here. I was one of those teenagers too. And Sheldorf always said that he would give opportunities to young people. And he was kind of unique in that among people of his age. He trusted these young people to handle money and be in responsible positions, and they all came through for him.
Yeah.
Not just me, but I mean, they all did. It was just because we want the comics to go well.
Right.
It was one year to year, and everybody was cool with that. They understood. But it was just never sure we're going to be back next year.
And that's what we kept hearing is that I jotted down at the end of we've done I think 13, like we said, over the last 2.5 days, and I jotted down the main words that came up over and over again in my head, that what it meant, and it was accessible. So all these artists and all these adults were accessible to the kids. So you just go like it's been here. You run into someone in the elevator and you just start talking. Everyone was open. Accessible, inclusive, and the idea of mentoring and how important mentoring was for people to say, you can do this, not to say, oh, don't do this, and oh, that's a kid, I don't want to talk to him, So that kind of mentoring and how important it is to set people off in the right direction so that they know they can do these things. So that came up a lot.
Well, one of the things, I don't think this phrase came up this weekend at all, but one of the recurring themes was just the can-do attitude. Nobody felt like they were going to fail, that failure was an option. Nobody had an I can't do this attitude. I mean, the last one we did today, or that Mark conducted today with Igor Goldkind, he was 15, and they put him in charge of, what was
publicity.
It? Publicity.
Yeah, he was the science fiction liaison.
Of the science, And I think you asked him, well, did you think that did you think you weren't up to the task? And he seemed like, well, no, they just thought I could do it, and I did, And just this drive to make this work was just a theme throughout every one of the ones that we did. It was really amazing.
So this archive documents this optimism. Another thing that I heard is we would ask people, if you had one word to characterize Comic-Con, what would it be? And a lot of people, maybe everybody said fun.
Or so overwhelming. That was the other. It was either and then
you're talking about
it was overwhelming fun.
So here we are documenting fun.
And I'm getting paid for it.
Well, what's interesting is, I mean, it's very, very American. America's the first place where the pursuit of happiness was something written into the Declaration and the Constitution, that you have a right to that. Well, after the war, we've got youth with either a lot of time or whatever it was, but the pursuit wasn't just fun, but it was a large part of it. So here we are talking about documenting this desire to have fun in life. And what does that mean?
And a lot of these were like kids of World War II veterans and that sort of thing too. So they kind of brought that experience with them as well. So
I know that this question has come up every time someone asks, who are you interviewing? So let me run down the list of who we've done so far. We've done, let's see, yesterday we get Scott Shaw. I like to say it with the exclamation point. Wendy All, who put together Cafe Frankenstein, Phil Ye, Mark Ebonier, Greg Bear, Peter Jones, Roger Friedman, Gary Pagel, I'm sorry, I know I'm saying that wrong. Jeannie and Chuck Graham, Jim Valentino, Barry Alfonso, Igor Goldkind. We did Mike Towery and Jackie Estrada. We may do further ones with them.
Yeah, and
so
some
that's
of
what
these
we've
were
gotten
people
so
that
far.
had, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
No,
But
that's
some of
okay.
these were people that had the real comics-oriented interest, and some of them were people from more of a sci-fi background. Like his question to Igor, last one he did today, was that, well, what's your interest in comics? He goes, well, I didn't really have one. I read science fiction, you know, and then he knew Barry Alfonso, who kind of, you know, got him involved, I think, in '73, you know.
And
So
that's
anyway,
something when we were asking him about that, because that was coming up in the interviews, like, you know, people interested from a sci-fi perspective, from a comics perspective, and it was sort of, you know, they weren't in the mainstream and they all came together. So what brought people who were interested in that all together? And the way Igor put it this morning was, we were all interested in what we could imagine. So that's what tied everyone together for the comics. And so, yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Greg Bear said in his interview that he characterizes science fiction as the dreaming subconscious of science, and he said likewise comics. Comics operates in much the same way, imagination, dreaming, subconscious, and so those two were brought together that way.
yeah, another observation I'd like to make, just having sat through a few days of these, is just, it's really been interesting to hear the different points of view, and I mean, because they don't all agree on everything. I mean, believe me, you know, it's interesting to hear the different voices and the different perspectives. But those things that we mentioned before are the things that they seem to share in common. But it's really been interesting just to hear a lot of different points of view on this whole thing. It's really kind of transformed my whole thinking about Comic-Con and its origins. I've just been thinking about it in so many radically different ways. Yeah, Mark.
Well, talking about the points of view that we're getting that when we're sitting down with them, you know, I mean, they all bring something to it. What I'm noticing when I'm asking these guys questions is that almost all of them, it seems like they haven't talked to the others. So they're not getting their story straight. A little bit older and possibly had a little more experience. Someone who was a little bit young, whose mom was still there watching over them to make
Giving
sure
them
that
rides.
they got there,
Yeah.
giving them a ride, you know. And
Clear, yeah.
Downtown, we were downtown. I'm sorry, there weren't buses all over San Diego. I lived in Allied Gardens by the stadium. And Sundays, we met Sundays at the El Cortez at 2 o'clock. And I was in high school. And my mom would have to drive me, give up the Raider football game, which was a big issue with her. And drive down, you know, and she'd wait around down, or she'd go home and watch it, and come back and pick me up. And a lot of kids took buses, you know, from all over town. Then we met in Claremont. Again, public transit isn't what it could be around here. You can evolve that in you.
That issue came up a few times.
Once a month.
Yeah.
That is funny, because I've heard that from several of the people, that San Diego was a very different city, and getting to these meetings, getting there wasn't, you know, these guys were making pilgrimages to get to Sheldorf's house, you know, they were trying to get rides, they were trying to find out who had a car, and trying to meet together. So they weren't just all, you know, it wasn't like it is now, where they could very easily all get together, or go into a chat room and get together and talk and hand out assignments. These were guys who actually had to get together. You know, a 12-year-old had to ask his mom, can I go to Sheldorf's house, or can I go to a, you know, a dodgy bookstore that, you know, might be a little, you know, and they did. They got there, they were committed to it, they didn't think that they couldn't. So it is interesting that San Diego was a different kind of a town, you know, and you think about now, oh, well, they were in San Diego, so it must have been very easy to do these things. Not then. Not then. There was not, you know, there was no trolley, and there were a lot of things different. So very, very cool.
That's what I was going to ask. I was in another panel with all of these same guys, the Ray Bradbury panel, and they were all little kids, you know, 15, 16 years old. They were friends with Ray Bradbury, which is amazing. Did any of them talk about their parents' reaction? Because I think it was Ray Bear's mom drove them to pick up Ray Bradbury.
Right.
And they drove, and I'm like, what were their parents thinking? You know, at my age, my parents would be like, what are you doing? This is a 50-year-old man I'm picking up, and he's your friend, and, you know, or some of the older or people that helped them organize this.
Yeah.
Did they talk about?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they did very
Ken
much.
Kruger's bookstore. You know?
Yeah, Ken Kruger's bookstore in Ocean Beach.
Where they met early on.
Where they met early on, largely sold pornography. So, and we learned today that they would take blankets and cover up that when the kids came in. So they were very conscious of it, and you know, clear that these were still kids, and we don't want to influence them that way. But yeah, most of them, I would say, their parents were pretty supportive, and their parents gave them rides to these, or actually went to, wasn't it Barry whose mom went to the conventions with him, all the early Comic-Cons? She went with him, and enjoyed them.
Well,
so,
in a lot of cases too, their parents had bought them their first comics or,
Right.
or their first science fiction books or whatever. So.
we had one or two that said, you know, they were like, "You're crazy. This is dumb. Don't do this. You know, you go get a law degree." Man. But for the most part, their parents
Very
were
That's
supportive.
amazing. I think the times are so different now that I don't think a lot of parents would, you know, drive their kids around and pick up adults. And, you know what I mean? It just
Yeah.
seems like that was another thing
Well,
that was
maybe
special
the
about the time that this was
local
all
news wasn't
created.
Well, that was one of the things too. Some of them said, when we said to our parents, we're meeting with a bunch of teenagers to talk about comic books at a bookstore. Parents didn't know what was in the bookstore, so it was at a bookstore. So that's how you got away with it, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, just a couple things. Yeah, I'm in the second decade of Comic-Con, and and it's like I remember my first year and working registration for Mikey Renate and looking up, and everybody's going, "Oh look, there's Richard Alf." I don't know who.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and getting my education, because all I knew was Shel Dorff, because Shel told me all about Shel.
Oh yeah.
Shel was always good at promoting Shel, and God bless him, I love him, and he, I counted him as one of my friends. But like, I never got to know Richard Alf or Richard Butner, and some of the other people. I heard the stories slanted from various people who were first generational, Mike Pasqua, Clayton, and some of the other people. But I do know that some of the people that I was working with, who were just barely into their adult years, were some of those can-do kids. And it's like, people like John Rogers saying that he'd walk in to the film room and nobody be the projection would be running and nobody'd be sitting there manning it, and there wouldn't be anybody in the room. So he'd take the reel off and put what the movie he wanted on, and he'd start watching it. And that's how he became a projectionist and eventually the president of Comic-Con.
Okay.
And I knew stories like that. So I'm wondering, when are we going to go to the next decade with this project? Because
Well,
it is generational.
it's funny. You mentioned, like, except for the last 3 days, and people come stop by. What are you doing in here? And everyone wants to share their stories. And we're finding that there's so much passion about this that we just have so many to go now, even though we've done quite a few here. The dean of the library gave last week our development person in the library a grant that just crossed her desk and said, could this extend the Comic-Con thing? So we're going to look at further granting opportunities to get more funding for this and keep it going, because I think we really can and should. So
Yeah, it'd be good to do every decade
yeah.
and get perspectives and start working in perspectives from every, because it seems like there's a generation of every 10 years.
Yeah, I just have one follow-up comment, then I'll get to. It was interesting when we were talking to Barry Alfonso, which was yesterday, I believe. It's all kind of blurry now. He was the guy, as I said earlier, the 12-year-old who placed the original ad, and he was involved for a few years, and then went off and had a life and moved away and became a songwriter, wrote #1 hits, got nominated for a Grammy one time for writing liner notes for a Peter, Paul, and Mary box set. So he's had quite a different career outside of comics. He came back to Comic-Con in 2009, and I think he said it was the first time he'd been back in 33 years. And so guys like you probably never knew him because he was probably gone by that time, I would imagine.
Actually, he was a legend.
Yeah, okay, so...
No, he was. He was
yeah.
one of the people that Shel would, I mean, I went to Shel's house several times, and he would say, oh man, you would not believe this guy, Barry Alfonso.
He was called the Boy Wonder.
The Boy Wonder.
Brought that up a few times, yeah.
Yeah, and I knew him from Shel's stories and from Mike Pasqua and some of the other people.
But that is what's interesting, is that when we think about our own childhood, you know, you're a teenager, you grow up, everyone disperses, goes off to college, goes off here, does their own thing, and that's what these stories are as well. So looking back on it from our perspective and thinking, you know, Comic-Con's this big thing, and, you know, if you started it, obviously you've been there every year. That's not true.
Yeah.
So
Lives
they intersect, and you can see how that formative experience shaped their lives in other directions too, and how it all interconnects. So it's really about people.
Yeah, we had a question.
So I'm hoping that you do get your grant extended, because one of the things that interests me is that Comic-Con today is only peripherally about comics. I mean, there's comics there, but it's about media, it's about gaming, it's about books, it's about television. I mean, it is pretty much the gamut of popular culture. And I can sort of see how it got from point A to point B, but there's a lot of steps in the middle that I would love to know the story of, because how did we suddenly have the clout to get people like George Lucas and Harrison Ford and Angelina Jolie? And I've seen all of these people, Hugh Jackman, I've seen all of these people at Comic-Con, and I know, okay, we're close to Hollywood so they can get here, but why do they want to come? What
Right.
made this?
Ideas, imagination.
Yeah, and one of the things that came up a lot in these interviews, the idea that Hollywood was not there from the beginning is false. There were always movies involved, so it's just the entire thing has mushroomed and gotten bigger. But, you know, why did Ray Bradbury come? You know, because some kid called him up and said, hey, you want to come to our comic
But
thing, right?
one of the
You know,
ones
I mean,
in the early 70s, Frank Capra showed up.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about filmmakers,
Yeah.
Frank Capra was there.
Who was it? Chuck Norris was there
Chuck
one year.
Norris was there,
and, yeah,
There's
and
that great picture
Star
of
Wars.
Scott Shaw drawing it.
You know, we talked about the history of Star Wars.
And speaking
some
of
these.
Star Wars, actually at the 76 con, a year before Star Wars came out, they were here promoting that film because they were so worried that there wouldn't be an audience for it. And they were trying to figure out, how can we build an audience for this movie before it comes out so that it'll be successful?
And
even
these
they
are our
couldn't imagine
people.
it
Let's
was
show
gonna
it to
blow up
them,
the way
and that's
it did,
kind of what happened. So,
And so they were, actually Star Wars was here a year before it came out, and that was in the mid-70s.
yeah.
Just a quick side note, the Jabba the Hutt's tongue came from San Diego too.
You?
It came from Shamu.
Explain.
It came from Shamu.
Yeah.
He saw Shamu give the kiss with the big tongue coming out of his mouth,
Okay.
and he says, that's exactly what I need to have for Princess
But
Leia.
I was going to say, I would agree with you though, then one thing that did come out is that the Hollywood thing has exploded, I think some people use the word hijack, some people use the word explode, to describe what has happened in more recent years with the dominance that it's come to have there. Yeah, so you know, you're not the only one who's made that observation.
And
It's
while
true.
I agree with you, I hope they get their grant money as well. I think that you'll be surprised what's already in the record. You know, you might think that possibly these guys haven't kept up with it or don't have opinions on what's happening at Comic-Con, but they all do. I mean, they all have you know, everybody has touched on what it has become, and just about everybody, and people have different opinions, you know, about that, about the size of it. And some people have said, you know, you can still carve a small con experience out of this larger con. And some people say, hey, the money coming in, it drives the recognition and allows people to still come together, you know, to say, hey, this is a big deal, I want to be there. But everyone does have an opinion on it. It has not been uncovered, you know, it has been well
It's gotten a lot
covered.
harder to walk across the exhibit from the dealer's room.
Yeah, these people have thought long and hard about what it had meant to be a part of it. I think some of them have just started thinking about that as they've come to this. You know, this is kind of, you know, people who've been away for it a long time, like Igor or Barry, have used this weekend as an opportunity to really think about what this monster they created has become. And they've been really thoughtful answers. It's been really incredible the kind of thoughtful responses that we've gotten from people who were there at the beginning and what they think it's turned into now.
And bringing it to Comic Fest here, I clearly was not at the first Comic-Con. But everyone talks about their experiences there, and the pool at the El Cortez, for example, became a character. You know, everyone brings that up. And so there's these pranks that they used to do, being able to run around the hotel and, you know, find hidden alleyways in the hotel, and that feeling that you're not really doing anything bad, but maybe you're doing something wrong, but kind of not, just to be excited, you know, and being able to just walk up to someone in the elevator and start talking to them. Hearing all those experiences changed my perception of a con so that I feel like I can do that out there, and I'm like, oh, they want us to talk to them, you know? Because sometimes at Comic-Con it's so big now that you feel that distance. You have the movie star who someone's going to body check you if you try to talk to them, you know? And the artists and writers are not like that. They want to talk to you, they want to mentor young people. So I have a different perception myself now of being able to talk to people.
Of course, some of them charge more for their signature now.
That's true. Yeah.
If I can jump in again, I go to a lot of cons. You know, smaller sci-fi book-related cons. I also go to the World Science Fiction Convention. And those are all about, you know, authors, maybe illustrators if you're talking graphic novels, and to a much lesser degree, but there is some element of media, because George R.R. Martin is there and Game of Thrones is on TV, Charlene Harris may be there and True Blood's on TV. I mean, so yes, it touches. But the thing about Comic-Con, and I go to Comic-Con every year too, I am, you know, total nerd, is that there is so much going on that it's not possible to do everything. I mean, sometimes to do one thing that you really want to do, you have to give up almost everything else that day because you're going to spend all the time in line to get into the one thing you want to do. So, no, I'm not, yeah. But, okay, but that wouldn't be one thing I stood in line for. But yes,
5 minutes.
but the point is, what it's become now, by its very nature, makes it harder to connect.
Right.
You know? So the smaller cons are where you do have the opportunity to talk to authors you like one-on-one and to touch people in a way,
Right.
as opposed to watch them.
Yeah,
When
and
I
the
think
whole
of-
age. Yes.
When I think of the explosion that you're talking about,
Or even below 20.
Yes.
some very powerful seeds must have been planted at one time, and they've been able to touch the imaginations of people across lots of disciplines in lots of areas, and that's something that needs to be understood.
It's almost like the ultimate revenge of the nerds, you know?
One of the things
I was a nerd
I
too,
found
so I
very
can say that,
interesting,
so.
somebody from, who was a grad student somewhere, came to the art show. I work in the art show every year now. I just hang out there. And he came and we were talking. He said, yeah, I did a questionnaire where I went through 5 Hall H lines during this convention. This was not this past one, but the year before. And I questioned everybody and said, is this your first Comic-Con? And if they said no, I said, have you attended any other convention, science fiction, fantasy, or otherwise? And to a person, they all said, you know, that this wasn't the first Comic-Con. They would say, yes, I have, and it was because they went to Comic-Con, and at least they got contact, and they walked into somewhere, and they got enough interest where they were going off to a WesterCon, or to a conference, or a Star Trek con, whatever their interest was. And Comic-Con was we're the big tribal gathering of all the geeks.
On this coast. I grew up on the East Coast. My first cons were over there, but.
So, you know, but like, you know, everybody comes to Comic-Con, but eventually they filter back out and they go to the smaller cons throughout the world. And they go to World Cons, they go to
World Fantasy.
World Fantasy.
Well, there's
Con.
more of them popping up all the time.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah.
I was wondering if in the course of these interviews you found a new appreciation or lack of appreciation for the role that schools and academia have in fostering fandom.
That did come up a few times. The way it came up though was more that back in the day it wasn't accepted. It was, you know, that's trash, why are you reading it, here's the canon. So that did come up a few times. It's noticed that it is more accepted now, and that the more we study that, the more accepted it will be, and you know, the more that we can encourage people to read it, you know, or kids to read it. So that did
It's
come
already
up.
happened.
Yeah.
It's
But
already
I would
happened.
like to
Lowbrow
add-
now is
Ones
like
I
that.
know, you have all
Yeah.
the time are the academic oriented ones.
Yeah, I would like-
introducing
all
us
right.
in the classroom.
I would like to add, though, at San Diego State, one name that came up often at San Diego State was a professor named Elizabeth Chater, who mentored Greg Bear, and they taught a science fiction creative writing class, you know, what, 40 years ago? I mean, it was a long time ago. And we have her science fiction collection in our special collections area. And so there were pockets of it even back then. And I think she was very supportive of some of the people that were involved with
And that's where you
Greg
get,
Bear,
you know, the different perspectives. So, you know, I think it was Greg didn't think
Although
that
there
the
was
English department had a
resistance,
problem
yeah.
about it, but someone else told us,
Yeah.
yeah, the English department did
resistance
not
there,
like
yeah.
that she was teaching the science fiction class. So you have different perspectives there too. So
Dr. Putman has been teaching a Star Trek course for years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
no, we
it's
just
wildly
talked
popular.
yesterday, it was a great talk.
There was also a professor, I don't know his name, over at Grossmont College that was teaching a sci-fi course
Okay.
in English Lit.
Well, and Stephen Potts has been teaching.
but I think
Yeah,
that
Stephen Potts,
idea,
Yeah, he's taught at State and at UCSD too. I think.
when we were talking about the mentoring, the adults telling kids, it's okay to do this, you know, this is good, encouraging that mentoring aspect, I think that's what teachers are as well. So that's where the importance comes in to saying, yeah, this is okay. And
I hear a lot about Kirby, Bradbury, Forey Ackerman, you know, this weekend, and it just strikes me. It's interesting that they're not mentioning their high school teachers or their elementary school teachers
Yeah.
as playing a kind of role in developing.
They were more widely read than their high school teachers.
Yeah.
But several times people would speak to that mentorship.
Okay.
They would say, you know, here I am, and there's Ray Bradbury, there's Forey Ackerman, and I can be like them one day. And I think that's something that's happening with all the cons. The same sort of thing. Young people are coming, and they're in the midst of extremely successful people, and they realize I can be like that too if I have the same devotion and love.
so
Anyway,
our
we're-
time is up.
yeah.
Um,
We have stuff up here if you want to come up and get it. It's got the web address. You can take a look at our web page and find out, you know, when the oral histories are going to be edited and ready to go. So
Thank
anyway,
you
thanks
all
so
for
much.
coming.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Oh, it's completely changed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.